I have read a report actually citing an unnamed congressional source that the invitation has been extended actually, but an official announcement is still forthcoming.
We'll come back to that interview in just a moment. This is Asia News Weekly, the podcast featuring news, commentary, and analysis from the Asia Pacific region. What are the implications of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe addressing a joint session of the United States Congress? Why is ISIS recruiting in Asia? And what exactly is Thai democracy? These stories and more are coming up next on the March 27th edition of Asia News Weekly. Hello everyone, welcome to this week's podcast. Thank you so much for taking a moment out of your day, out of your week to join me. My name, of course, is Steve Miller, and it is my pleasure to be here with you. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, it is absolutely no secret that Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and his Liberal Democratic Party have, well, what some would say is a distorted and revisionist view of history, particularly as it pertains to Japan's role in World War II, and that, of course, has severely complicated relations here in East Asia. Now, in fact, despite the ability of the foreign ministers of Japan, South Korea, and China being able to meet and conduct business, the heads of state of these three nations have yet to meet, have yet to have a summit. But Prime Minister Abe is poised to address a joint session of the United States Congress. What could be the ramifications of such a visit? For that, I'd like to welcome onto the podcast Piin-Fen Kok, Director of the China, East Asia, and United States program at the EastWest Institute. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for giving me this opportunity.
So my first question to you is this. A lot has been made of this invitation that may be coming from the U.S. Congress for Abe to address a joint session of the United States Congress. Why is that being made out to be such a big deal?
Well, firstly, as far as I understand, no sitting Japanese prime minister has ever addressed a joint session of both houses in Congress, so this is a big deal. Prime Minister Abe's grandfather, himself a previous premier, had addressed a session in Congress, but not a joint session. Things are, it's a very interesting time right now for U.S.-Japan relations. Well, on the economic front, both are concluding negotiations on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the congressional role is very important in the U.S. Because the president would need the Congress to grant him fast-track trade promotion authority to facilitate the TPP. And on the security front, the two countries are revising their defense guidelines in recognition of the more proactive global role that Japan wants to take on. But the timing of this visit and this expected speech is the fact that this year is the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. So a great amount of attention both in the U.S. and globally, and especially in the Asia region, will be paid to any remarks by Prime Minister Abe on Japan's role during the war.
Well, and I wanted to ask you about that because that has been the subject of a lot of debate. Abe, the LDP, certainly have what many call a revisionist review of Japan's role in World War II, and even some veterans have asked that either Abe not be allowed to address the joint session or that only on the condition that he takes a more repentant view of history. What would be the ramification for the United States in Asia should Abe be invited to address the joint session and not take a more repentant view of history?
I think that it will not be well received at all in Asia, especially by its two closest neighbors, China and Korea. And from the point of view of China, that would fuel even further the narrative by the Chinese that the U.S. is just enabling Japan for its own selfish strategic goals, ignoring history and the role that Japan has played in the war. And for Korea, it's just going to be a very tricky situation for the U.S. in trying to manage relations with its two main allies in the region. And as you know, and as your viewers and listeners know, it's been a rough time these days for America's relations with its allies in other parts of the world, whether it's tensions with Israel over Iran, or the UK, France, and other European allies joining the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank led by China. I'm sorry. So I don't think the U.S. could scarcely afford any blow-up in relations between Japan and Korea.
If that being the case, do you think then that invitation would not be extended?
I have read a report actually citing an unnamed congressional source that the invitation has been extended actually, but an official announcement is still forthcoming. Of course, I'm not sure, how accurate that report is, because it's not been,
hasn't been confirmed.
Reported. It's not been confirmed more widely among the media. So we'll just have to wait and see.
There's been a lot of speculation that coming up in August, on the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, that Abe may adopt less apologetic language in his address. Could we see something like that should this invitation go forward?
I think Abe himself had said back in January that he does plan to express remorse for Japan's role in the war, and to uphold the statements given by previous Japanese leaders. So I think in general he would probably abide by the spirit of what has been said before. It's all, like they say, the devil is in the details. It's all a matter of how nuanced an interpretation he himself wants to give, and things like referring to aggression, whether he would mention those kinds of that kind of verbiage.
Okay, one last question. This hasn't necessarily to do with Abe, but this past year there's been a lot of discussion on Japan's reinterpretation of Article 9 to allow for collective self-defense, to use its self-defense forces in a more forward operating position. The United States has come out and said that it agrees and supports that change, but it's widely unpopular in Japan. And I wanted to get your opinion on this. Should that change, whether or not it's a referendum or a true constitutional change, fall flat in Japan, what could that mean for U.S. interests in Asia, specifically for territorial disputes in the South China Sea and East China Sea?
I think we need to make a distinction between reinterpreting Article 9, which is what is happening now, with the ruling coalition preparing a timetable and draft legislation to the Diet to be passed to lift the ban on collective self-defense and reinterpret Article 9 in essence. That is distinctly different from actually changing the Constitution, which some have said that is the ultimate goal of Prime Minister Abe, but changing the Constitution will require a public referendum, and given the split in public opinion about this issue, that's going to be exceedingly difficult, almost impossible to achieve. But to your question about the prospects of say, the legislation in the Diet that is most likely to be presented in the coming months, or maybe by next year, if that should actually, for some reason or other, fail, that would, I guess, conceivably limit or eliminate what Japan under Prime Minister Abe would desire to do in terms of a more proactive role in partnering with the U.S. and other countries in the region to defend their maritime interests, whether it's in the East China Sea or in the South China Sea. But even so, even if the legislation is passed, the whole notion of collective self-defense, or CSD, faces severe specific constraints under which such collective self-defense can be exercised. So in itself, the parameters are pretty narrow for Japan to have greater flexibility in the role of its SDF. So I think it's, again, a lot has to a lot will depend on internal politics. A lot will depend on the coalition partner, the Komeito, which has its own reservations and adopts a more pacifist stance. And talking to Japanese experts and Japan watchers, I guess the general sense is that to the extent that legislation is passed, it was most likely going to be pretty watered down and constrained and limited.
Piin-Fen Kok is director of the China, East Asia, and United States program at the EastWest Institute. Thank you so much for your time this week.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I have to ask you, what are your thoughts? Do you think Prime Minister Shinzo Abe should be extended this opportunity to address the joint session of the United States Congress? And possibly, what could be the ramifications here in Asia? Now, coming up later in the podcast, Thailand's Prime Minister says the new government will be democratic, but with Thai elements. The Islamic State is a cancer thrust upon the earth, and in addition to the attacks it carries out in the Middle East, it's spreading its tentacles into Asia to recruit its youth. Joining me now on the phone is Peter Chalk, senior political scientist with the RAND Corporation. Peter, how are you doing today?
Good, Steve. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for asking. Peter, we've seen it in Indonesia, we've seen it in Australia, here in South Korea, and most recently in Hong Kong with these flyers for the domestic help there. Why is ISIS recruiting members so far away from Iraq and Syria?
Well, I think part of it goes to the group really wants to stamp itself as an international organization, one that has transnational following beyond the Middle East. And I think that they see that as very important to legitimizing its cause amongst the wider Islamic world. The other aspect here is that Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, has actually historically played quite an important role in terms of providing recruits for jihadist conflicts certainly in Central Asia, as well as in the Middle East. So it's not surprising, that they would be looking at getting potential Islamists from there. I would say they're probably also looking at Malaysia as well. And then, of course, you've got countries within the region that are very closely associated and correlated with the U.S.-led war on terror and recruiting homegrown terrorists from places like Australia and then encouraging them to carry out attacks back in Australia precludes the necessity for ISIS itself to come to that part of the world and conduct attacks. So it's a very effective cost-saving tactic, which is minimal risk. So I think it's a combination that Asia has historically played a role in providing recruits. It's a way of attacking allies of the West and the United States without actually coming to the region. And then it's also probably an attempt to try and brand itself as an organization that has a truly international following and can attract jihadists from all over the world, which in turn will then increase its credibility to attracting recruits closer to where its main operations are, such as from Europe and North Africa.
Keeping with that globalization theme, we've seen several groups pledge loyalty to ISIS. In the Philippines, there's the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters. In Africa, Boko Haram. What kind of security concerns does the globalization of ISIS present?
I don't think it exacerbates the security concerns that much. These groups like BIF in the Philippines and Boko Haram, certainly Boko Haram, I think now has pledged allegiance as a cry of help. I mean, it's more the fact that they are probably wanting support from money and arms from ISIS, and that's why they're doing it. I don't think ISIS is going to provide that. I mean, they're going to be focused on their main operations. So I don't really think it's going to exacerbate the threat, and I don't see ISIS themselves going to those countries to conduct operations. It's probably just an effort by those militant organizations themselves to try and bolster their own support at a time when the security forces are making inroads. I mean, if you look at Boko Haram, although the Nigerians have done an awful job in confronting them, the Niger and Chad militaries are doing a very effective job, as are South African mercenaries. And they are definitely on the back heels now. So I think trying to bolster its fledgling support by tying itself with an organization that is viewed as very effective as one means of trying to counter that reduced efficacy within their main theaters. So I think it's more a rhetorical thing on the part of the groups themselves than a real fear that ISIS will then try and establish cells in those countries. That's only going to happen much closer to home, across North Africa, Libya in particular.
And what kind of different responses are we seeing?
Well, a lot of the Western countries are focusing on counter-narratives, counter-radicalization. I mean, as you've seen, they're also closely monitoring and tracing individuals that they suspect may be going to Turkey and then on to Syria to join with ISIS. But I certainly don't want them coming back. There's increased surveillance. You've seen a lot of countries that have historically had pretty sharp curbs on anti-terrorism legislation, and the powers of the security forces actually loosening those constraints. Canada's the most recent with its, the C-51 anti-terrorism bill that the Harper government has just introduced. And it's quite telling that a country such as Canada, which has historically been very conscious of checks and balances and civil rights, are taking moves that are very similar to what the UK has done and what the US has done. And then, of course, you've got countries that are not concerned with human rights, really. They're just doing a very strong military crackdown with the security forces. I think you'll see that with Tunisia now. Egypt's already doing it. Unfortunately, Libya, there's no central government. Same is true in Yemen. So I think ISIS itself may be more tempted to relocate to places like Yemen and Libya, where the potential for concerted draconian counter-terrorist operations is far less. But in the West, I think you're seeing a general shift towards security away from freedom, and that's generally, I think, supported by most of the population. And then in North Africa, you're definitely seeing a shift towards a much more forceful draconian counterterrorism response that is being, military or security force led.
Peter Chalk is a senior political scientist with the RAND Corporation. Thank you so much for joining me this week.
Okay, Steve.
Unfortunately, more and more young people are leaving their homes to join ISIS. So my question to you is this: what do you think is the solution to stop ISIS from recruiting Asia's youth? Please leave your thoughts in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. And coming up in a few minutes, what are the ramifications of state-sponsored cyber attacks? This past week in Thailand, Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha said that while Thailand was moving towards a return to a civilian-led government, that the democracy that would finally be established in the kingdom would have Thai elements. And that's a very interesting topic. What exactly is a Thai-style democracy? Well, for that, I'm inviting onto the podcast Joshua Kurlancic, Senior Fellow for Southeast Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations. Joshua, how you doing?
All right.
Given the current restrictions in place in Thailand, are we seeing any kind of concrete steps moving forward to a democracy and a return to a civilian-led government in Thailand?
Well, the two things aren't necessarily the same. I think that there probably will be a civilian-led government sometime in 2016. I don't think it's guaranteed, but I think that it's likely. That's the timetable that the government has set out. I don't know that it will fulfill the standards of an electoral democracy because the charter that's being drafted significantly weakens political parties, and it potentially allows for an unelected prime minister, and it creates an unelected upper house, and it has, in other ways, restricts the franchise. But I think it is likely that the country will move towards some sort of civilian government next year.
Is that what he meant when he said earlier this week about a democracy with Thai elements?
I don't know what he means. I mean, for a long time, many of the Thais who have not been happy with the results of elections have said that in various ways Thailand needs a Thai-style democracy that somehow suits Thai characteristics, but I don't really think that means anything more than ways to manipulate electoral democracy. I mean, every country has its own unique characteristics, and democracy can be formulated in different ways, but I don't think there's anything inherently unique about Thailand that means that democracy has to result in a sort of unelected system, the way that the charter might be drawn up on. But frankly, I don't know. I don't know exactly what Prayut meant when he said that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone really knows what he exactly meant when he said that. You mentioned before, Prayut has said that hopefully in sometime 2015, early 2016, there will be a civilian-led government. What are the next steps that need to take place to make sure that that road to democracy, road to a civilian-led government, is actually on a path moving forward?
Well, actually, originally the junta said that there was going to be an election in 2015, and now it's been pushed back to 2016. And the line being seen right now is early 2016. First, they have to formally finish the charter that will establish, well, it's a new constitution, so they establish the way the country is governed as well as how elections will run and the constitution of the parliament. Then they would have to hold elections. Right now, it doesn't seem like they're going to put the charter to a public referendum, but I mean, it's still possible. So in theory, I guess that's possible. I mean, I don't know what else. Prayut could stall elections for a whole number of reasons. He could stall elections by saying that the country hasn't reached a certain level of stability, or for other reasons.
Well, he's actually come out and said that. He said that as long as there's, civil unrest, opposition towards the junta, that a return to democracy, a return for civilian-led government may be postponed, that the martial law and other ordinances will stay in effect.
Well, yeah, he said that. It's hard to know what for sure is going to happen. I mean, first of all, Prayut likes to talk. He doesn't necessarily seem to think all the time before he says things. Also, he has a pretty antagonistic relationship with reporters, so he seems to say things because he just wants them to be quiet. But yeah, it's possible that there could want some certain level of stability before moving towards elections. You could have elections with martial law still in place. That's certainly possible. Martial law has been in place in the southern part of Thailand for years while there was elections going on. I also don't necessarily know that. I mean, moving towards having an election probably would be better than the current situation in terms of reflecting some degree of popular will. But an election under the charter that's being discussed isn't necessarily going to be create a real electoral democracy. It's also not necessarily going to make a lot of Thais happy. So it's probably better than the current situation, but it's not necessarily a solution.
Joshua Kurlansik, Senior Fellow for Southeast Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations, thank you so much for your time this week.
Okay, thank you.
In just a few moments, a roundup of stories from the Asia-Pacific region you may have missed. Last year, Sony Pictures was hacked by the Guardians of Peace. Some say North Korea was actually ultimately responsible for that hack. And then in December of 2014, North Korea experienced a massive internet outage. Just recently, Representative Michael McCall from Texas confirmed there were some cyber responses to North Korea, but the CIA later neither confirmed nor denied that the United States was behind them. Returning to the podcast is Lillian Ablon, researcher with the RAND Corporation, to discuss this. Lillian, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thanks.
So I have to ask you, the outage in North Korea, is that a fairly common thing to see?
Cyber attacks on state-sponsored actors are quite rare, and cyber attacks are different than cyber exploitation. So let me explain that a little bit. Cyber exploitation it happens much more frequently, and these are things like conducting intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, scoping out a particular entity, gathering information, perhaps exfiltrating that data. Exploiting a system is much more common than actually attacking it. In the news and often in reports and how we talk about cyber instances, we just use the blanket term cyber attacks, but really what we tend to be talking about are cyber exploitation. The attack on DPRK really can be categorized in an attack because a cyber attack consists of something that denies, degrades, destroys, or disrupts a computer system, network, or computing component. And so something like a distributed denial of service or something that stops the connectivity, like what we saw, would be an example of an attack. We don't see many of these attacks. Really what we see more often are the cyber exploitation.
As we move forward in this digital age, do you think we'll actually see more state-level sponsored cyber attacks?
We don't see that many kinds of attacks like the scale of DDoSing North Korea's network, or things like attacks on Saudi Aramco in 2012, attacks on South Korean banks in 2013, or going back to 2007 with the attacks on Estonian networks. It's thought that these were conducted by state-sponsored actors because those are the types of actors who had the level of sophistication in order to conduct these widespread, damaging, destructive attacks. The truth is most countries, most state-sponsored actors don't want to get to this level of destruction, denial, disruption, because there's deterrence at play. There are consequences in terms of diplomatic, economic, political, financial, and military that keeps these kinds of attacks at bay.
Lillian Ablon is a researcher with the RAND Corporation. Thank you so much for your time this week.
Oh, my pleasure.
And what do you think? Was the United States behind the DPRK cyber attack? Be sure to let me know in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. And don't forget, on the Asia Now podcast this week, I spoke with Phil Robertson from Human Rights Watch about the state of human rights in Asia. So what else has been happening in the Asia-Pacific region? Well, probably the biggest story of the week has been the passing of Singaporean founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. Now, I'm not going to spend any time enumerating his many accomplishments, because let me tell you, there were a lot. But I am going to ask you this question, and I really want you to think about it. Look at the way the world has responded to Lee's death. And I'm talking about the way specifically world leaders are responding. They're doing more than simply offering their condolences. They're really taking a time to offer their respect to this very elder statesman. And I use that word deliberately, statesman, because if you take a look at our politicians today, I don't think anyone truly lives up to that definition. In fact, going back in time, there's only a handful that I would say are the same caliber as Lee. I'm talking about FDR, I'm talking about JFK, and let's throw in Winston Churchill, shall we? No one else has that gravitas. And I think that's very sad. Not only for our world today, but for those that are growing up in it. I really wish we could have politicians of this caliber in the 21st century. In some other news, the United Nations is planning on opening an office in Seoul to monitor human rights issues in North Korea. In a letter to the Voice of America, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights said it was still in the process of finalizing administrative matters on the establishment of the field-based structure with the government of the Republic of Korea. The structure is expected to open in Seoul during the second quarter of this year, and as one might expect, the move drew protests from the DPRK. Now, will this new office in Seoul make any difference in North Korea? Probably not. I hope I'm wrong. But unless the United Nations get some teeth behind their sanctions, behind this Commission of Inquiry report, not a lot is going to change in Pyongyang. Switching gears to Vanuatu, authorities are warning of critical food and water shortages following being ravaged by Cyclone Pam on March 13th. So far, 11 are confirmed dead, leaving thousands homeless, and the United Nations is calling for $23 million in aid. Some areas have been completely wiped out, and residents are left with nothing. Remember, it's not just about food and water. It's about aid being delivered, and specifically aid that will stem the spread of disease. Because if that enters into the equation, things could get a whole lot worse. Moving to India, a very interesting story about cheating on exams. Police in Bihar, India rounded up about 1,000 individuals in a cheating scheme aimed at helping students pass their school-leaving exams. People were literally climbing the walls as some 1.4 million students were taking the exams. Those caught were fined 2,000 rupees, which is about $32. This isn't the first time this has happened. In 2013, 1,600 students were disqualified from tests for cheating. And one final note, Takesuru 17-year-old malt of Japan's Nikka brand was awarded the best whiskey of 2015. So once more, the best whiskey in the world for the second year in a row is from Japan. Reminds me, I need to get some of that. Well, my friends, here we are once more at the end of the podcast, and it's time for me to share some of your most excellent comments. First up, from Red White Dude, I am skeptic about the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, primarily because China has a track record of taking out their political agenda in business. You probably know how Chinese retaliate against countries who have hosted the Dalai Lama or have dealt with the Republic of China or Taiwan. Chaloner says, sadly, Philippines is so corrupt, they can't do anything about it. Hyun-Soo Yim on the UK joining the AIIB said, any leader of a country in their right mind would know it's a horrible idea to blatantly take sides between the two most powerful countries. Look at Britain. They are supposedly America's best friend, yet shows no hesitation in developing closer ties with China. Yi Font said, I think AIIB will collapse in a couple of years. Everyone knows China government and financial sector is inept or inefficient in area needing the high-level skill and knowledge management. And Bao Pham posted this, which appears to be translated through Google. China stopped the behavior unruly. Need to be negotiated both sides in front of international public opinion to clarify all the sovereignty in the region waters. That's shown all history proofs of Vietnam. Please respect sovereignty territorial sea islands, as well as the reefs belong to Vietnam sovereignty. Again, these are some amazing comments, and I truly do appreciate them. Even if English isn't your first language, yeah, go ahead and use Google Translate to leave them down in the comment section on Facebook or Twitter. And if you have a YouTube account, go ahead, shoot a video reply, give me the URL. You never know. You may find yourself appearing in one of these episodes up on YouTube. And of course, if you'd like to record your reply and send it in as an audio file, I'll be happy to use that as well. Stay dialed in with more news from the region by following Asia News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter. You can also send an email to the show with your questions, your comments, and your feedback. That email address is podcast@asianewsweekly.net. If you enjoyed this week's podcast, please share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already yet. Subscribing is absolutely free, and you can do that here on our website, asiannewsweekly.net, or in your favorite podcast application like iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or TuneIn Radio. Well, my friends, that is it for me today. Thank you so much for spending part of your day, part of your week with me. I really do appreciate it. So until next time, my name is Steve Miller, reminding you to be true to yourself and to always be awesome.